Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I've only covered these kinds of cases a few times. We're talking about close encounters of the second kind. The title of today's episode is It Doesn't Get Any Weirder Than This: 10 Extremely Bizarre Close Encounters of the Second Kind. Yeah, it probably can get weirder than this, but trust me, these cases are very weird. Just so you know, a close encounter of the second kind is one that affects the witness or the environment in some way. So almost all of these cases involve landing traces, physiological reactions, electromagnetic disturbances, animal effects, these kinds of things. Over half of them are multiple witness cases as well. So very well verified cases here. I will be covering 10 locations, 10 different cases. And these locations include Argentina, 2 from Argentina actually, 1 from Australia, 1 from Chile, 2 from Colombia, and the rest are in the United States, including Illinois, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Ohio. By pure chance, these cases are clustered together in time from 1976 to 1982. Guess it was just a very active era of UFO activity. But I am sure you will find these cases absolutely compelling, fascinating, and that they have a lot to teach us about how UFOs can affect the witness and the environment. So let's get started. First case I want to talk about is so amazing, so encouraging. It's just really a delightful case. I call this one Something Unimaginable. And I think that's an accurate term which the witness actually used because you could never have imagined something like this happening. This occurred in 1976 in Tolima, Colombia. And wow, this is so amazing. This incredibly bizarre and fascinating case comes from respected Spanish researcher Salvador Freixedo. It is a multiple witness case. He was able to interview one of the primary witnesses who, as it turns out, is a very famous journalist. Her name is Ines de Montana. She is very well known for her contributions to the Bogota newspaper El Espectador, which means the spectator. She was really a pioneer of female journalism in Colombia. At the time of the event, Ines lived with her family and friends in her ancestors' hacienda in an area called Honda. This is located in Tolima, Colombia. This is a 4,000-foot high valley surrounded by much higher mountains of the Colombian Andes. It was early one morning in 1976, before the sun had risen, that Ines and other members of the household awoke to find the air filled with smoke. Rushing outside, they were alarmed and frightened to see the glow of a huge wildfire advancing towards their home. Soon they could see that trees and crops were already aflame, and the fire was advancing quickly. The farmhands began running around frantically, searching for axes to create a fire break, as there was no water to really extinguish the flames. The fire, however, was moving very swiftly, and in the space of just a few minutes, they saw enormous flames cresting over the adjacent hill, sending thick clouds of smoke into the sky. The farmhands did their best, but it was clear to everyone that their efforts were going to be insufficient to stop the fire from spreading. Already, they were retreating from the advancing flames as the heat was far too much for them to stand. The dried leaves and brush provided a lot of fuel for this fire, and everyone was frightened that the old hacienda house, which was made of wood and had been there for a very long time, would go up in flames and be destroyed in a matter of minutes. And it appeared as if all would be lost when something incredible happened. As Ines says in her own words, suddenly something unimaginable appeared from the west. It was like a helicopter of light. It came slowly, and its brilliance wasn't like a diamond's, but rather had bluish hues, and you could gaze at it intently. My whole being became eyes gazing at it. Inez's friend Jovita shouted out, "Mrs. Inesita, look, look!" Inez replied, "I'm watching." That was all she could say. Now, it was obvious to everyone that this was a UFO. It wasn't anything normal. Driven by anguish and desperation, Inez's friend Jovita raised her arms to the sky and shouted out, "Martian gentlemen, help us! This land of Mrs. Inesita cannot be burned. Save the little animals. They are blessed." Now, Inez and the others could hardly believe what happened next. As Inez says, "I heard their pleas as if they came from afar, while that thing, I don't know what to call it, advanced, outshining the stars in that summer sky. I had the impression that it was going to land on us. But at the height of the coconut palms, it rose again. It moved away slowly, leaving a luminous trail, like the tail of a comet that moved harmoniously, as if to the rhythm of a Strauss waltz." Now, the temperature around them was now already over 100 degrees from this fire, and everyone there watched in absolute astonishment as the UFO unleashed an intense blast of ice-cold air. The cold air almost instantly extinguished the roaring wildfire around the estate, and in fact it was so cold that everyone began to shiver from the cold. Inez herself ran inside and grabbed a coat to keep warm, then ran back outside to watch the flames rapidly subside. The UFO paused for a few seconds over the now dying flames, and then began to move slowly across the entire front of the fire. And wherever it moved, the flames died down as if being drenched with tons of water. Now, many of the farm hands at this point were on the other side of the house trying to contain the fire, and they didn't see the UFO, but they did feel this sudden rush of cold air. And one of them, Luis, said, "It was really cold. It was such a mild cold that it put out the flames. All I could do was roll down my shirt sleeves." So in a matter of minutes, the 60-foot-high flames had been reduced to nothing, leaving only smoking ground. And as Inez says, "The above is my truth, supported by the testimony of 4 people who felt with me the effect of a strange phenomenon. And because in more than 30 years, no one has been able to say that in the hundreds of pages I have written, there has been fantasy, fiction, or lies. Since then, when I close my eyes to remember, I see it again as something I never suspected or dreamed of in my life." How crazy is that? A UFO that puts out a wildfire, firefighting extraterrestrials. It's not a unique case, actually. I do know of a few other cases, but this one is probably the most dramatic that I've heard. I wonder about it. It's a multiple witness case. It's pretty well verified. In fact, the main witness being a famous journalist, I think she's of very high credibility. And I wonder if perhaps that was why the UFOs came down to save their house, because she was a very influential person in Colombia at that time. Don't know, hard to say, but an absolutely fascinating case either way. Now let's move to another one. Every time you think you've heard everything, another case comes along that makes you go, wow, never heard this before. I call this one, "This Was the End." This occurred on May 5, 1977 in Bogota, Colombia. It's technically a single witness case involving a very unusual physiological reaction. The most common physiological reaction is that a person's eyesight is affected in some way, perhaps redness or irritation, but in this case, it was very extreme. This has got to be one of the most harrowing encounters on record, certainly for the single eyewitness. A 22-year-old student pilot by the name of Manuel Jose Lopez Ojeda. At the time of the incident, he had less than 40 hours of flying time, so he's definitely an amateur pilot. It was at 9:15 a.m. on May 5, 1977 that Manuel took off from Bogota, Colombia and began a solo training flight in his 100-horsepower Cessna 150. Soon he was flying above the 8,500-foot-high mountains above the town of Tabio. This is north of Bogota, and he was practicing steep turns and dives when he suddenly noticed that all the gauges on his instrument panel were malfunctioning or reading 0 or in the danger zone. And also the plane itself was making a strange shuddering, vibrating motion. So he quickly realized he was in trouble and he wisely decided to take immediate action. As Jose says, I started looking for a field to make a forced landing. But when I started looking down on my right side, I saw a huge vehicle, a machine, a few feet below me, and at times it would come right below the aircraft. And when I tried to straighten the steep turn in which I was in, I found the controls of the aircraft would not obey. The whole aircraft seemed to be locked onto this machine, or being controlled by somebody else. It was somewhat disconcerting. The aircraft was not responding to my movements of the controls. It was at that moment I began to feel a strong pressure in my ears and head. My hands and body were itching. However, I was very conscious of all that I was doing and seeing. This was all happening in just a matter of seconds, since the UFO, which initially was on the side of the aircraft, had moved down just below the landing gear of the plane. It was at this time that the situation got even worse for me and the plane I was flying. It was shaking with even greater intensity, and the controls were not working, and the instruments continued to show 0, but the plane continued to fly in a circle at the same altitude. So Jose said that the craft looked like an inverted dish. He estimates it was about 50 to 60 feet in diameter and about 10 feet thick. A reddish-yellow light was located at the top center. He said it was snow white in color, aluminum, metallic looking, with no windows, no markings of any kind. But he could see that this craft was moving in quick zigzag movements beneath his plane. Now gradually, Jose started to notice a very alarming development. His eyesight was starting to fade. As Jose says, the UFO moved to the front of the plane, and that was when I began to lose my sight. Everything looked cloudy. For a moment, it seemed I was recovering my visibility, but I was thinking to myself that this was the end for me. It seemed as if I was flying over a desert and mountainous zone, always in a circle. The strange object disappeared, and I was left blind. It was like being in a fog. I couldn't distinguish any objects too far. So I asked for guidance to be able to return to my base. Another aircraft approached my aircraft. By this time, my vision was lost completely. I couldn't see anything, not the dashboard. I couldn't see outside my plane. So Jose radioed the Bogota tower in a near panic, saying, "I've lost my sight. I don't know what to do." He repeated that several times. Now the tower supervisor at Bogota, Pedro Pisa, was initially skeptical of Jose's report of another aircraft because he saw nothing on their radar. But hearing his calls for help, 4 flight instructors immediately took off from Bogota in separate planes. They did not see any UFO either, but they did find Jose, and they flew up as close as they dared to his plane and did their best to guide him home. In fact, this conversation was recorded at the control tower at Bogota, and it was being aired live, so there was a lot of people listening to this. Here's a little snippet of this conversation. The instructor, the one who's trying to save Jose, says, "Okay, now begin slowly the turn to the left. Slowly, slowly, slowly. Turn to the left. To the other side is the left. Left, left. That's right, the left is the other side. To the side by the door. Turn to your side by the door. Do you hear me?" Jose replied, "I hear you distinctly." So Jose was clearly frightened and disoriented. It took him a little bit to understand. And as the instructor said, "Good, but turn to the left. Not to your right, but to the left. That's it. Turn more. Yes, softly. Continue turning very softly, very softly." So for the next hour or two, the instructors guided Jose towards the Bogota airport while doing their best to keep the frightened Jose from panicking. He was absolutely in fear. Finally, they reached the airport, and it took them several attempts to guide him to the runway because twice Jose almost flew into the control tower. He still had no vision, and was in fact in such a bad condition that he admitted that he could not even remember his own name. But thankfully, Jose's sight started to return, and finally the instructor flew directly in front of Jose's plane, and he was just barely able to see the shadow of the plane in front of him and was able to make a perfect landing. Men from the Bogota airport immediately pulled him from the plane after he landed. He was placed into an ambulance and was rushed to the hospital. Once at the hospital, Jose's condition improved rapidly, and before long his sight was completely restored. Now, one of the witnesses there at the time, pilot Rudolfo Ficini, was able to determine that Jose was in fact an excellent student pilot, not given to hysteria. As Rudolph says, "The guy's a serious type fellow. I spoke to his instructor, and during the few weeks he had been at the school, he has shown to be a capable pilot. He is serious and quiet and has not made an impression on anybody as being a charlatan. His story has been somewhat reluctantly told, but it has been accepted. They believe that he did encounter something or other on that morning of May 5th. And in confirmation of his encounter, reportedly, UFOs had been seen in that area less than 1 month earlier, on multiple occasions actually." My heart goes out to that pilot. That had to be very harrowing, very scary. Thankfully, he fully recovered. Not exactly sure what happened there. I speculate that maybe he had hysterical blindness due to his own fear, but that's pure speculation. And the fact that so many people do report their eyesight being affected in some way following or even during a UFO encounter, well, clearly that was what was going on there. Truly an amazing encounter. And yeah, other activity going on around that time lends additional credibility to his report. But certainly this did happen. I mean, he was hospitalized. Such an unusual case. And now we go to another. I have never heard a case like this before. Not in the details that these witnesses describe. Again, multiple witnesses. I call this one UFO Spoils Barbecue Picnic. This occurred on August 22nd, 1978 in the small town of Coronel Dorrego, Argentina. This one is unusual and bizarre for sure. This case comes directly from the Crónica newspaper of Buenos Aires, Argentina, so I don't believe it's been officially investigated, but it sure is interesting. On August 22nd, 1978, 3 people had gone hunting at a ranch in Estancia, just outside of the Coronel Dorrego area of Buenos Aires province in Argentina. That evening, they began to cook some meat, which they planned to enjoy with some bread and wine. But around 8:30 p.m., as they were just getting ready to eat, they started to hear a strange noise. They were unable to describe it or determine its source, but around that same time, they did notice a very strong odor of sulfur. And now, looking down at their food, the meat, they were shocked to see that the meat that they were hoping to eat in moments had turned a, quote, suspicious purple-pink color. Not only that, their bread had taken on a very strange, spongy texture. Both appeared to them to be inedible. Now, at first they couldn't understand the cause, but as they looked around them, only 300 feet away, they saw a UFO hovering overhead. They described it as circular in shape, with a black center, white edges, and the whole thing was giving off a bluish reflection. Now they were so stunned that at first they just stared at this object in shock. Finally they came to their senses, they jumped into their car and drove off to inform the owners of the estancia where they had been hunting about this UFO. But at this point, the craft struck them with a beam of light. The next thing they know, they are facing another direction, 150 feet away on an adjacent road, which they could not have crossed without having driven over an area of plowed land, which would have been very difficult to do in their vehicle. And none of them felt any of the bumps that they should have felt if they had driven over the rough terrain. In fact, as one of the witnesses said, it seemed as if we went through the air. So now, finding themselves in this unfamiliar location, They stopped the car suddenly, the beam of light went out, the UFO was gone, and they raced away from the location. So technically that does fall under the category of a close encounter of the second kind, given that the witnesses do feel the presence of this UFO affected their food in that very unusual way. But a close analysis of the case, seeing that they suddenly found themselves on another road, felt the car floating through the air, that to me sounds like a close encounter of the third or fourth kind. They were probably taken on board, just given that, that they found themselves in another location from where they began. So that sounds like missing time. Would love to talk to those witnesses further and get more information. There's a lot to unpack with that case, but certainly qualifies as being extremely bizarre. All right, now let's move to this next case. This one is unique. I've never heard anything quite like this one before. It's technically a single witness case, though there was a corroborating witness who saw UFOs in that area at that time, as we'll see. But I call this one, Everything Was Enhanced. This occurred on September 30, 1978, in a very rural location known as Laguna El Aljibe, Maria Teresa, Argentina. This man was driving alone on a dirt road out in the middle of pretty much nowhere when he had his encounter, which would absolutely change his life. This next case was also published in the Cronica newspaper of Argentina, and it was investigated and published in the Tribuna newspaper. It was investigated by the CIC, the Cosmo Biophysical Investigations of the Argentine Federation of Research on Extraterrestrial Science. The sole witness is Jose Marchisio, a 53-year-old married man from the small town of Maria Teresa in Argentina. It was around 11:30 p.m. on September 20, 1978, as Jose drove from the town of Santa Isabel to the town of Maria Teresa where he lived. This is less than 20 miles away. Now he decided to take a shortcut, the dirt road between the two towns rather than the main highway. And he had just reached the section where the road borders a small lake known as Laguna El Aljibe, when about 600 feet ahead of him, seemingly sitting on the road itself, was a large glowing red sphere. So he continued to drive closer, thinking that this was another vehicle, but he could soon see that there was a dark green object of some kind behind the reddish sphere. Now this globe seemed to be slowly expanding in size. Still thinking it might be another vehicle on the road, he signaled it with his headlights. But he now realized that this looked a bit strange to be another vehicle, so he pulled over to the shoulder of the road. Now at this point he felt no fear. But then, at that moment, the red sphere seemed to explode, sending out rays of multicolored lights in all directions. At this point, everything became very weird and bizarre. Jose said he felt disoriented, and inside the car he said it was filled with a strange sensation. As he says, everything was enhanced. The dashboard, the gauges, and the steering wheel were shining. At the same time, the size of the objects, including myself, seemed bigger. In front of the vehicle was a silver road, glistening like a carpet made of cigarette paper. So meaning it's very shiny and reflective. Now Jose realized that the car lights were now off, and he seemed to be suspended in the air and traveling at high speed. He was completely unable to control the car. As Jose says, my hands and feet were always still. Only I felt a heavy pressure in the back of the neck and also on my breast. I neither saw any people nor saw any people or unknown beings. I always looked ahead of me. I think the car's engine was not running. I could see the car and myself enveloped in a very powerful light. I noticed the smallest details inside the car, but very enlarged. Through the rearview mirror, I could see my features enlarged. I noticed a small scar on my hand in all its details. So after an undetermined amount of time, the car seemed to slow down, the strange glowing light and the other weird effects suddenly stopped, and Jose found himself back on the road. It took him several moments to realize that he was now 7 kilometers, 4.3 miles, from where he had first entered this light. Now he had no idea how he got there. The road that circles the lake has many corners, and he did not remember taking any of them. And as Jose says, afterwards, when I was near my home, I became very frightened. At the same time, the pressure on my breast increased, turning to pain. I commented nothing to my wife, but the next day I had to go to a local clinic. I then commented what had happened to the doctor. So besides the pain in his chest and neck, Jose says he also suffered from some vision problems, some mental confusion, an impairment of his reflexes, and he says that for the next several days there was a strong sulfur smell inside his car. The car battery was drained as a result of the encounter, nor would it hold a charge, and it had to be replaced. Also, the fuel gauge no longer worked, and in further confirmation of the encounter, another witness reported seeing a UFO streak across the sky around the same time as Jose's encounter. Now, Jose says that before the encounter, he was a UFO skeptic. Needless to say, he now believes. I think you'll agree, that was a very weird case. I mean, we do have the electromagnetic effects with his battery being drained, his car battery, and the weird effects on the fuel gauge. Also physiological effects, him feeling unwell after his encounter. But to me, the most interesting aspect is how he described the interior of his car and his perception being so drastically altered during this encounter. I don't even know what was going on there or even how to describe it. You could see the witness himself had a lot of difficulty conveying the details of his encounter. It's just so unusual how this encounter almost altered his perception in some way. Not sure what to make of it. All right, let's move to the next case. This one is very brief on details. It's quite short, but it's so unusual. Never heard anything quite like this that I just had to include it. I call this one One Good Turn. This occurred on October 12, 1978 in Linares, Chile. And yeah, this is a multiple witness case, and it is so unusual. Oh, this case is so strange. It was published in the newspaper La Tercera de la Hora, the third of the hour. It was on October 12, 1978, that a group of people were traveling along the rural road between the two Chilean cities of Linares and Constitucion. This is about 350 kilometers, 217 miles south of Santiago. Now the strangeness began when suddenly the driver and passengers saw a large, quote, red spot. They estimated it was about 750 feet long, and it was so bright it was apparently shining into the bus itself. So the driver immediately pulled over, he and the passengers disembarked, and they began to walk towards the area where this unexplained red light was emanating. And they were just about to reach it when suddenly the red, quote, blob disappeared. This caused a tremendous gust of wind. They returned back to the bus only to find a mystery. The bus had been turned around 180 degrees and was now facing in the opposite direction. Nobody was able to explain how this happened, nor did anyone see it happen, though presumably this giant red light had something to do with it. Interestingly, on that same day, a Chilean national TV camera operator reportedly videotaped a UFO over Portillo. This is north of Santiago. I would love to talk to some of those witnesses. Doesn't sound like this case was ever professionally investigated, just reported in the newspaper. But how unusual is that? I mean, just imagine driving along and suddenly you come upon this big glowing object. Everyone gets out of the bus to see what's going on. Next thing they know, the bus is facing in the opposite direction. Nobody saw that. So this happened in a split second, I guess. Maybe there was missing time. Again, we don't have the details that would really confirm that. But I'm guessing this was a straight up UFO display. An intentional encounter designed to really convince the witnesses that, hey, UFOs are real. We are here. Or maybe there's more going on there. Perhaps it was preventing an accident and basically wanted them to go the other direction. I don't know. That's pure speculation. It's fun to speculate sometimes because that case is so unusual. Just imagine the UFO lifting up this bus, this big heavy bus, and turning it around, and nobody even seeing it happen. So strange. Now let's move to the next case. I like this one because it's very well investigated. There was a whole mini flap of UFO sightings going on in this area at this time. This witness did come forward. I suspect there were quite a few who did not. Some absolutely did. But this particular case is really unusual. Probably the least unusual of all the cases in this collection, but definitely worthy of inclusion because of what this witness describes. I call this one, I Was Frozen. This occurred on January 5, 1979 in Sturbridge, Massachusetts. This case comes from highly respected and prolific researcher Raymond Fowler and was published in the 134 issue of the MUFON UFO Journal. On the night of January 6, 1979, just after midnight, the police station at Sturbridge, Massachusetts began to receive calls from people in the area reporting UFOs. One caller said he saw a, quote, diamond-shaped object, which he said came down and hovered only 100 feet over her car. Another caller said that earlier on the evening, which would be January 5th, a UFO had caused a traffic jam along Route 49. This is just north of Sturbridge. But perhaps the most interesting and important here is a report which came from Tom Emery, who was actually calling for his sister Anne Marie, who had a frightening encounter with 3 UFOs, one of which she said was only 20 feet away from her car. It was on the night of January 5, 1979. Anne Marie, then 20 years old, had left a hotel in Cambridge where she was employed as a housekeeper. She was going to visit her parents who lived in Springfield. This is a journey of about 88 miles. She was driving her 1970 Ford Maverick and had just passed through the city of Auburn, had just moved beyond the intersection of routes 90 and 290, and this is when she noticed 3 red glowing, what looked triangular-shaped objects flying in a precise formation about a quarter-mile off to the left side of the road. They were kind of flying around a mountain. They looked so strange to her that she slowed her car down to better observe them. Now she also noticed several other cars slowing down. She did roll down her window, but could hear no engine noises coming from them. But she did see that the objects not only glowed red, they had red blinking lights. Her radio was playing and her CB radio was on, but the volume was turned down. Now she watched these objects for the next 20 minutes as they seemed to keep pace with her car. Then, reaching the intersection of Route 90 and Route 84, all the other cars that were traveling with her turned onto Route 84, leaving her alone on Route 90. She traveled about 1 mile, and coming around a corner, she now saw the 3 glowing objects hovering right over the road, directly in front of her. In fact, she estimates that the closest one was about 10 feet in the air and no more than 20 feet away. One was off to the right about 40 feet away, and the third was off to the left about 60 feet away. And as Anne Marie says, my car came to a stop. I never shifted. My foot was still on the gas, and it never stalled out. The engine was still running. It's not exactly a quiet car. I could hear the engine going because there was no other noise. My radio and CB went off, so Anne Marie was close enough that she could see these objects very clearly. She estimated that they were about 10 feet wide. Each object was shaped like a 4-sided pyramid with the apexes facing her car. They were a solid red color and appeared to be constructed of smooth, glass-like material. They glowed from within, but had no discernible light source. She could see 4 brighter red blinking portions which protruded along the back sides of the objects. These lights blinked about once every 2 seconds. It was around this time that she did notice a very strange odor. As she says, there was this funny smell. almost like a skunk, but like a sweet skunk. It was really weird. Now, Ray Fowler believes that this was probably ozone, but Anne-Marie at this point found that she was unable to move. She was completely paralyzed. As she says, "I was frozen. As I approached them, my car slowed down and came to a stop. They never approached me. My foot was still on the gas. My engine was still running. It wasn't racing like if I had had it in neutral. It was still running at the pace when I was driving, and I felt my face getting very, very hot." Now, Anne-Marie also reports that she felt somewhat mesmerized. Her eyes began watering as the face-off with the three objects continued for what seemed like a long time, but she estimates was probably only about 2 or 3 minutes in duration. I think that's still a pretty long time. But suddenly she saw the headlights approaching from a car coming in the opposite direction, and this seemed to encourage the objects to take off, because at that moment the object on the left rose up 300 feet, then the middle one rose up 300 feet, joining the other one, and the third object on the right joined the other two in precisely the same manner, and then all three moved simultaneously, heading towards a distant hill and disappeared into the distance. Instantly, Anne-Marie's radio began playing, the CB radio went back on, and her car began to move again, and of course Anne-Marie found herself able to move. As she says, "I clutched the steering wheel so hard, I have long fingernails, I put scars in my palms." So she immediately drove to her parents' home and initially did not talk about her encounter until her mother confronted her. As Anne-Marie says, "When I came back to my parents' home, my face was like sunburned." And as her mother says, "She was a little late coming in. I walked into the kitchen and her face was beet red. She just looked stupefied, amazed. So she asked her daughter, 'What's the matter?' Anne-Marie replied, 'You're not going to believe me.' But she then explained what she had seen, and of course her mother did believe her. Now at that point, neither of them realized that other people in the area were reporting what appears to be the same objects. In the days that followed this sighting, Anne-Marie says that she had a bit of a rash and peeling of the skin around her eyes and above her nose, much in the manner of a mild sunburn. But Raymond Fowler writes of the other sightings in that area on that night, as he says, "At 6 o'clock that evening, 2 witnesses at Leicester stopped their car to watch 2 strangely lit, silent objects hover, perform sharp turns, and move away. An hour later, at Worcester, a physics teacher and former Navy jet pilot and his son watched in amazement as a lighted object approached, then reversed direction without benefit of a turn before hovering and then moving away behind the trees." Huge thanks to Raymond Fowler for doing such a thorough investigation with that case. I mean, he actually talked to the witness's family, friends, co-workers. He really does his due diligence. Huge kudos to the witness, also Anne-Marie, for coming forward. Amazing. Just imagine driving along, you're seeing these 3 UFOs, they're pacing your car, other people are slowing down and watching this, and the second she's alone on the highway, these craft come down and almost land right in front of her on the highway, blocking her forward progress. To me, this is, again, a clear example of what I would call a UFO display. They wanted to be seen. I mean, that's inescapable. Sort of this little standoff between her and the UFOs. Amazing. It's a scene straight out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And she even got the sunburn that we hear in a number of cases. So yeah, an important case for sure. All right, now let's move to the next one. I found this one, I don't know, really poignant. It just stuck in my mind for some reason. Something about the witness, I guess. This one I call Knocked Over by a UFO. This occurred on August 17, 1980 in Lima, Ohio, actually in the parking lot of a factory. We do see a lot of cases where UFOs hover over technological installations, so perhaps that's what's going on here. But hearing about the witness, I wonder if perhaps the witness was the one who attracted the UFO. This amazing case was published in the Frontiers of Science magazine September-October 1980 issue and was investigated by John Timmerman of the Center for UFO Studies. It occurred at the Teledyne Steel Foundry plant located at Lima, Ohio. The primary witness is Philip Battle Sr., age 42. At the time of the encounter, he was employed at the factory as a security guard. At around 1:15 a.m. on August 17, 1980, he was driving his truck in the north parking lot of the factory when he noticed an unusually bright light in the sky. Now, as it turns out, this was not his first sighting. In fact, starting at age 13, as a young boy in Alabama, he has seen a number of UFOs over the years. Like most witnesses, he never reported them for fear of ridicule. So on this occasion, when he saw the strange light, he instantly recognized it and realized that he was having another sighting. Unfortunately, he was alone. So he stepped out of his truck and he could now clearly see a round, flat, silvery object off to the east, about 270 feet away, he estimates. He could see what looked like small holes on the surface of the object, as well as bright yellow and white floodlights all around the perimeter circumference. The lights remained solid and were neither flashing nor rotating. Now, as he watched, this object moved back and forth in the same area for a period of about 5 minutes in a very unusual way. He said it appeared to do a slow flipping maneuver, in other words, going end over end. He said it looked to him as if it was trying to attract his attention. Now, he wasn't sure how large it was or how high up, but it appeared low to him and had the same apparent or angular size of a full moon. He estimates that it could have been about 12 to 15 feet wide. Then suddenly, and without any warning, it sent out a yellow beam of light, which struck him on the body, physically knocking him back against his truck, actually scarring his knees, bruising his kidneys slightly, causing his left eye to become reddened. At this point, the beam retracted. The craft then started to move away, dimming in brightness. So Philip immediately tried to call his partner on his CB radio, but it wouldn't work. So he immediately ran to the guard office to get his partner and a third worker to come outside with him to the parking lot. Unfortunately, by the time they arrived, the craft was nowhere to be seen. So the three men walked through the parking lot, and sure enough, they could see this craft, and now had the appearance of a bright light about, they estimate, some 1,200 feet away to the north, and was just high enough to clear the north plant building. The two other witnesses agreed that the object or light was slightly larger than the moon and was difficult to watch because it was so darn bright. It remained hovering for about 15 or 20 seconds, then drifted to the west and out of view behind the building. Now Philip ran after it all by himself and watched it as it floated over the company pond before leaving for good. 3 days later, he says, on August 20 at 11:36 p.m., he saw it again, but this time it was just an anomalous light and it moved away quickly. But certainly a profound sighting, one of the major ones in his life. Philip died at age 78 in 2017. How amazing is that? I think, again, these cases are important because they do show some interesting behavior in UFOs, and I'm underlining it in this episode. I think that was a UFO display. In fact, the witness himself, Philip, said that he was struck by the fact that this UFO seemed to be trying to get his attention. And given that he had multiple encounters starting from a young child, never reported them, well, he reported this one. The question is, why did the UFO strike him with this beam of light, practically knocking him over? I'm speculating here, but I'm thinking that it did this to really shake him up, to let him know that, we know about you, you are a contactee. This is an experience that you can't deny. So maybe that's what was going on here. But I'm so glad he had other witnesses to support and confirm the sighting of this UFO, because it's got to be very stressful. In fact, I know it is. When a person is alone when they have their encounter, Sometimes you can hardly believe your own eyes. So an amazing case for sure. All right, let's move to the next one. This one is absolutely outrageous. Of all the cases in this collection, this one's probably the most famous. It did get quite a bit of publicity at the time, but I don't know how well known it is. It certainly deserves to be well known. I call this one, I Saw This Thing. This occurred on September 30, 1980 in the tiny little town of Kilmeny, Australia. This case has it all: landing traces, physiological effects, animal reactions, the whole deal. And it's so extensive and so exhaustively investigated, and there are supporting witnesses that it's undeniable something truly profound happened with this one. But I wanted to include it because it shows a kind of UFO behavior that we see periodically that I think really says something important about UFOs, and in particular the ETs themselves. Again, this extraordinary case received considerable publicity, being published in newspapers and several UFO publications. It was thoroughly investigated by Australian researchers Paul Norman, Bill Chalker, Keith Basterfield, and several others. The case is very well authenticated with multiple witnesses, landing traces, animal reactions, physiological effects, electromagnetic effects, and more. It all began around 1 a.m. on September 30, 1980, when farmhand George Blackwell, then age 54, was woken up by the neighing horses and bellowing cattle on the 500-acre White Acres Cattle Ranch. This is located along the Princes Highway in Kilmeny, Australia. Now, along with the panicky sounds of the animals, George could also hear an unusual whistling sound, and looking outside to investigate, he saw an orangish, bell-shaped object floating and rotating about 10 feet above the ground, some 550 feet away, between a shed and a cypress hedge near the house. Now, he first thought that it might be some kind of aircraft in distress, but the object was too close to the ground. In fact, it was so close that the bottom section was partially obscured by the shed, and after seeing its unusual shape, he knew it was not any normal kind of aircraft. He estimates it was about 25 feet in diameter, 15 feet high. It had bright orange and blue lights on the side, each about 7 inches in diameter and spaced 10 feet apart, and a bright white dome on top. Strangely, it did not illuminate the ground below it. The craft seemed to move purposefully, intentionally, as it maneuvered directly over an open 10,000-gallon concrete water tank, which was about 1/4 of a mile away from the house. At that time, the tank was full of water. This object proceeded to hover directly over the tank for at least 1 minute. And as George says, I saw this thing, about 10 to 15 feet high, with a row of lights like portholes. It was white with a black-brown band. So this tank was some distance from the house again, so George quickly got dressed. He jumped on his Suzuki motorcycle and drove to the tank. He saw that the cattle had fled to a corner of the field, and the horse was running around in a circle, clearly disturbed. Arriving at the area, he saw that a cow was, quote, disturbed and frothing at the mouth. And he could now see that the object had landed or was hovering just above the ground in a field about 50 feet away from the tank. So George approached it within 50 feet, but he moved no closer because of the intensely loud whistling sound emanating from the object. So he just sat there, still mounted on his motorbike, for about 10 minutes watching the object. He said his body felt really strange, quote, like a plate of jelly, as he just sat there watching it. Suddenly the whistling noise increased in volume to an awful scream, he said. And at that moment, a black tube-like appendage came out from the bottom of the object, increased to a, quote, tremendous size, and then produced a huge blast of heat and air that was powerful enough that it nearly knocked George off his bike. In fact, he could feel heat coming from the blast. The object then rose upward slightly, moved about 30 feet, and became silent, apparently creating a suction which lifted debris up from the ground, because at this point, stones, weeds, leaves, and cow patties rained down from its underside. George's motorcycle light was pointed upward, and this allowed him to see a spoke-like pattern on the bottom of the craft. The craft then moved slowly away and disappeared into the distance. As George says, the thing lifted off, just narrowly missing the shed and the water tank. It went between them. So George looked at his watch and saw that it had stopped at precisely 1:10 a.m. Now when he took his watch off, it functioned normally. But when he put it back on, it stopped again. He tried this several times. He estimates that the craft was visible for almost 45 minutes. And going back to his house, he saw it was now 1:50 a.m. He didn't sleep well that night, and at first light in the morning, he returned to the site. And going to where the craft had hovered, he saw a 28 to 30 foot diameter circle and a 14 to 18 inch wide ring. This was of grass that was browned and flattened in a counterclockwise direction. Now inside this ring, the grass was normal except for 6 evenly spaced spokes radiating outward from the center. The stones, sticks, and cow patties that he had seen falling from the object were strewn along a pathway leading out from the circle in the direction that the craft had departed. Now afterwards, the cattle on the property avoided the circle and could not be forced to go near it. But then came the shocker. The 10,000-gallon water tank was almost completely empty. The owner of the property arrived at 9 a.m. that morning and noticed that George was white as a sheet. George explained what happened, and by 11 a.m. that morning, he started to feel very unwell. The owner of the property alerted the Gippsland Times newspaper, and this led to the case being publicized and investigated. Meanwhile, George's condition worsened, and in the week following the incident, he became very ill, suffering from headaches, vomiting, diarrhea. He was unable to sleep at night and would wake up in a cold sweat. Now, as investigators converged on the scene and word of the sighting spread, more witnesses started to come forward. An anonymous truck driver says that a few hours before George's encounter, he was actually followed by an object for some miles while driving towards Rosedale. This is just a few miles to the east of Kilmeny. Soon another witness surfaced, Kelly Possel, who lived 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles away, and says that at 12:12 a.m. that evening, she looked out her bedroom window and saw an object that looked like a pink ball of fire moving slowly off in the western sky. And later more witnesses were found, a mother and daughter who said that they saw flashing lights in the area at that time. Now investigators went over the timeline with George from the time he left the house to the time he returned, and they were puzzled by an apparent time discrepancy of some 20 minutes, which George was unable to account for. They did test the area for radiation, but this turned up negative. As George says, "I know what I was seeing. It was all so clear. I didn't believe in this sort of thing, but now I'm convinced. I tell you, if anyone wants convincing now, they should come and see where this thing landed." Now the aftermath of this encounter persisted for months. Carloads of people began to converge on the property to view the landing traces. Reportedly, the publicity and attention from the sighting became so overwhelming that George was eventually forced to leave town. And a final note, just over 1 month later, William Dingwall, who owned a large property in Bundalagwa, only a few miles from Kilmeny, reports that he discovered several perfect circles of burned grass within a 600-foot radius that surrounded his huge natural billabong. A billabong is a natural water source, like a pond. But per William, at the time these rings appeared, he did notice that there was an unusually low water level in the billabong, which was normally constantly full. And he also adds that he was awakened one night several weeks earlier by, quote, "the high-pitched sound of rushing air and the cats and dogs making a terrible fuss." And in further confirmation, at the same time of all of this, his son George reported that he had seen a strange green light in the sky over the fields. William was reluctant to go public with his story, quote, "for fear of being ridiculed." A very profound encounter. I feel bad for the witness, suffering from what looks like radiation sickness, although he didn't go to the doctor to confirm this. It sounds like he got a little bit too close to this UFO. But how amazing is that it drained this giant water tank of all the water inside of it? We do see a number of cases like this. And the fact that there was another case nearby in that area just a short time later, also involving water being taken out of a pond. Well, there you go. This shows that UFOs sometimes do take water. There are a number of cases like this of pools being drained and lakes and rivers and so forth. So yeah, all entities need water. I think that's what's going on here. But an absolutely undeniable and very important case. And just to underline the fact that this sort of thing happens, here's another one involving a UFO that appears to be interested in getting water. I call this next case another thirsty UFO. This one occurred on July 11, 1981 at a Girl Scouts camp in Port Byron, Illinois. This is a single witness case, but it is pretty well verified. It was investigated, and it's so astonishing what happened in this particular incident. This next case comes from the January-February 1982 issue of the magazine Frontiers of Science and was first reported to the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies, QFOS. The reporting witness was then the camp director of a Girl Scouts troop at Port Byron, Illinois. It was 10:30 p.m. on July 11, 1981. The Girl Scouts had left the camp for the day. The supervisor was alone at the camp headquarters, which served as his home. At this time, his wife and 2 children were away, so he was alone in the house, except for his dogs. Without warning, the dogs started barking as if there was an intruder outside. So he went outside to investigate and immediately saw very bright lights by the camp swimming pool. Now he couldn't see it clearly as there were many trees blocking his view, and his first thought was that somebody was sneaking into the pool for a late night swim. But that didn't seem to make sense, as an intruder wouldn't normally turn on the pool floodlights, so he immediately slipped through the trees and into the clearing where this pool was located. And he now saw that the pool lights were not on at all. Instead, directly above the pool, this was a pretty big pool, and higher than the floodlights itself, was a brilliant light. He only saw it for a few seconds when it became extinguished. There was a loud whirring noise that rose in pitch and became softer, as if this object was moving away. The supervisor took a moment to gather his wits and turned on the pool lights, and this is when he got an incredible shock. The water level in the pool was down by 3 feet. This meant that some 30,000 gallons of water were gone. He immediately wondered if there could be a possible leak, but examining the pool, he saw no leaks. But he did notice that the 24-hour pump, which runs continuously unless manually turned off, was not running. Then came another mystery. Normally the pool is chlorinated. However, the remaining water in the pool appeared to have no chlorine in it whatsoever. The supervisor was stumped to explain all of this, other than it had something to do with this apparent UFO he had seen hovering above the pool. It took him about 1 month to report this encounter to QFOS, and he only did so after hearing about another televised UFO report involving a sighting on July 22, 1981, 11 days after his. This other report was over Muscatine, Iowa. So amazing. I mean, clearly this UFO took the water from that pool. But what's even more amazing is that suddenly this water is no longer chlorinated. They dechlorinated it. How interesting is that? I've never heard that before. But it would make sense. They want pure water. The water for this pool apparently does come from a well as well, so it would be good, clean water, presumably. But yeah, another interesting example of UFOs taking water, which we see periodically. So interesting. And now we get to the last and final case in this collection. This one to me is the most poignant. It's just such a really amazing case in terms of how the witnesses were affected afterwards. I call this one From Somewhere Else. This occurred on September 30, 1982 in Hampton, New Hampshire. This is the location of a very famous giant wave of sightings in Exeter, New Hampshire back in the 1960s. So perhaps that's related to this. Hard to say for sure. There are 4 witnesses in this case. They all verified each other's story, but it was the aftermath of one witness that really prompted me to include this case in this episode because it is amazing. This amazing encounter involves 4 witnesses, all friends, and at the time of their encounter, co-employees at New England Telephone Company. Their names are Nikki LeClaire, Mary Ann Poland, Rose Messina, and Mary LaMontagne. At about 10:15 p.m. on the night of September 30, 1982, they were all in one car heading west on Exeter Road, just past the Hampton Machine Company in Hampton, New Hampshire. Mary Ann, age 44, was driving her Mercedes, which she owned, when she first saw what she assumed must be a plane flying unusually low over the trees just a short distance away. As she says, "I saw what appeared to me to be a very low-flying airplane. I watched it as I drove, and all of a sudden it looked like one big bright light coming towards me. So I still thought it was a plane. I reached over and touched Rose, who was dozing. She told Rose, 'That airplane is flying very low. You're supposed to be the co-pilot, so wake up.' Now Nikki and Mary saw this plane, quote plane, but weren't paying much attention to it. But Rose kept looking at it and finally said, 'Hey, wait a minute. That's no plane. Geez, Mary Ann, that's not a plane.' And Mary Ann shouted out, 'No, that's not an airplane. Look at it. There's no way that's a plane.' And as Mary Ann says, 'It came towards us. And with that, I got the attention of the 2 in the back. And they're looking at it and they say, "That's no plane. Stop the car." So now all 4 women were staring at it in amazement, and what they could now see was a very huge craft, quote, as big as a house. It was moving very slowly nearby at about treetop level, and they could now see that it was an oval-shaped craft ringed with flashing red and white lights. Now Rose Messina was in the front seat, and as she says, "So we all started to shout out, 'Stop the car! If you're not going to stop the car, we're going to jump out.' Now Mary, age 29, got a very good look at it from the back seat of the car and shouted out, 'Stop the car!' At this point, the craft was now moving over a nearby house. Mary Ann began to stop the car. This is when someone shouted out, 'It's going to hit the trees.' Another one said, 'The thing was so low that I thought it was going to crash.' Now before Mary Ann could bring the car to a full stop, Mary and Rose is 25 years old, opened the doors and sprinted from the still moving car, running up the driveway of a house to where the object was hovering. Their friends Mary Ann and Nikki stayed in the car and watched them disappear into the darkness. As Mary Ann says, "I'm still looking at it and applying the brakes. Meanwhile, these 2 nuts, as I call them, started hopping out of the car before it was even stopped. It was right there, on top of the car practically. It wasn't doing anything. It was just like stationary." And as Rose says, "So we opened the door. Mary Ann braked the car, but we got out before the car came to a stop. The 2 of us got out and started chasing it. It stopped. It was standing perfectly still, but there was no noise. So meanwhile, Mary and Rose, who ran after it, neither of them felt the slightest fear. They just ran towards this craft, which was slowly moving towards the edge of the woods, and they ran after it, finally reaching the edge of the woods, and just stared in amazement as this object came to a complete stop almost directly above them. It was totally silent. And as Mary LaMontagne says, "It was so close that if I'd had a rock, I could have hit it. I have a pretty good arm. It came and hovered right over the trees, and it was huge. It was very, very quiet. I didn't hear a thing. The only thing I heard was the rustling of the trees." So they were both enthralled and watched the massive craft with its flashing lights, which then, almost immediately, sent down a large white beam of light to the ground. Like a path to the sky is how one of them described it. The other said it was, quote, "like a ray of sunlight when it comes down through the clouds." It then retracted the beam and then moved off over the woods and was out of view. Now at this point, the owner of the nearby house flicked on her porch light, so Mary and Rose fled back to the car and to their anxious companions. They immediately began comparing notes describing what they had seen. They all agreed it was a large craft, oval in shape with lights around the edges, and that the wide beam of light had come down at an angle from the bottom left side. All were convinced it was a genuine UFO. As Mary La Montaña says, it was definitely a ship from somewhere else. Rose Messina said, I saw a huge oval object which was very bright. The fact that it made no noise astounded me. Now what neither Rose nor Mary could explain is why they felt so compelled to leap from a moving car to chase after the object. As Rose said, ordinarily, I'm afraid of my own shadow. I'm petrified of the dark. As Mary says, ordinarily, I'm chicken. If it had been an accident or a plane crash, I would have wanted to get out of there. But I just didn't feel that way. So the whole sighting lasted about 3 or 4 minutes. They went home, they called Pease Air Force Base, could not get anyone to take them seriously or even talk to them. They were all deeply impressed. Nikki LeClaire said that she was mostly impressed by the, quote, the brightness and size of it. Rose Messina said that she was impressed by, quote, the vastness of it. Then that ray of light that came down from it, like a beam of light when it shows through the clouds. Marianne Poland said, well, it was exciting, I'll tell you that. The thing that will stand out in my memory was that this thing was so low and so close that I thought it was going to crash, yet it made no noise. Now Mary La Montaña said, the thing that impressed me the most was that I ran towards it. The fact that I wasn't afraid, that I wanted to get out of the car and see what it was, that I could have followed the thing on if I hadn't been stopped by the trees. But it was her, Mary, who was most deeply affected by the encounter. In fact, she believes that the UFO occupants communicated with her telepathically, giving a special message meant just for her. Now, at the time of the encounter, Mary was a heavy smoker, indulging in 2.5 packs of cigarettes each day, as she had done for the past 14 years. But this was about to change. As Mary says, they want me to be healthy. I felt, because they stopped, they wanted me to do something. I sensed that it was okay, that they are not here to hurt us. I just know there is more, but I don't know when. So following the encounter, Mary quit smoking cigarettes, cold turkey. Practically overnight, she no longer had any desire to smoke. This amazed her friends, and they absolutely believed her when she said that the UFO was responsible. As Mary says, one night, about 3 days after the sighting, I woke up in the middle of the night. I just bolted out of bed and had maybe a minute with the shakes. But since then, I had no desire to smoke at all. I had no withdrawal symptoms. I just stopped smoking, and I haven't had a cigarette since. Now, Mary says the whole encounter left her, quote, with a private feeling of being peaceful and serene. I don't feel stress at all anymore. There's much stress at the phone company, and I never could relax. Now I'm not in a rush anymore. I see people around me being extremely nervous, but I don't feel that way anymore. I've changed my life considerably. The ladies did share their sighting with whoever would listen, and as a result, they received considerable ridicule. But they had each other to confirm their stories, and all of them stuck to it. Now later, Mary La Montaña and Rose Messina did become partners and co-owners of the very successful Blue Jay Motel in Hampton, New Hampshire. And again, a final note, this area was the location of a massive UFO wave known as the Exeter Incident. This was in 1965, and it involved hundreds of sightings which garnered national attention. What a tremendous sighting that was. And again, it makes me wonder, is this completely intentional? It sounds like it, because according to that one witness, this UFO came down and gave her a telepathic message, basically telling her that there were things in her life she needed to change. So this is a very personal encounter for this woman. So amazing that they came down and did that, and she listened and changed her life. How cool is that? I mean, it's just astonishing. So again, these cases might not involve humanoids, but I think you'll agree they're absolutely fascinating and do have a lot to teach us about UFOs, ETs, how they affect the environment, and more importantly, how they affect the witnesses, which is profoundly amazing. So that's it for today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed hearing about these 10 unusual cases from all over the world. Close encounters of the second kind deserve a lot more attention than they're getting. They have so much to teach us. So thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I hope to see you for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Signing off.